Good evening. I am Xavier Salomon, the Deputy Director and Peter J. Sharp Chief Curator at the Frick Collection in New York. This Friday and next week, in two parts, we're going to be talking about the Fragonard Room, one of the most iconic spaces at the Frick Collection. The series of canvases by Jean-Honoré Fragonard reached the Frick Collection in 1915, when Henry Clay Frick acquired him after they had been put for sale at the death of J.P. Morgan, who owned them since 1898. And it was the dealer Duveen who organized for Frick to acquire them. The room in which they're displayed today was a room which already existed at the Frick. The Frick was being built, the house on 70th Street at that time. And so the addition of the Fragonard canvases was a later idea by Frick after this important acquisition. When Morgan died, he had the canvases displayed in his house at Prince's Gate in London, in Kensington, and they were shipped to New York and they were on display at the Metropolitan Museum. And it was during this exhibition of Morgan's great artistic treasures that Frick saw the canvases and through Duveen acquired them for his house and then for the Frick collection. The story of the Fragonard Room is a rather complex one, and in fact is set as a two-part story. And that's what we're going to discuss this week and next week. So today, I would like to talk about the first part of the story of the Fragonard Room and of its creation, and next Friday will be the second part. This week, I am pairing the Fragonard Room not so much with a cocktail, but with a very simple drink, and the most delicious drink, probably, just a cup of champagne. And since we're going to be talking about Ancien Régime France and about kings and royal mistresses and court artists, I would like to raise a glass of champagne to Madame du Barry, who will be the main protagonist of today's episode. So the canvases were painted by one of the most celebrated artists active in the 18th century in France, Jean-Honoré Fragonard. Fragonard was born the son of a glove maker in the southern town in Provence of Grasse on the 5th of April, 1532. He grew up in Grasse, but moved as a young man to Paris to study in the workshops of two of the most celebrated artists in Paris, the painters of Paris at the time, first with Boucher and subsequently with Chardin. And it was during the time he spent in these workshops that he started to paint, as it was expected of an artist of the time in 18th century France, so to paint religious pictures and grand mythological pictures. And of course, this is what other artists at the time were doing to enter the academy, to become court artists. And so some of Fragonard's earliest works are difficult to look at today because we, of course, think of a very different painter. This is one of his early works, painted in 1751, the Christ washing the feet, done for the cathedral of his own hometown of Grasse. But 10 years later, in the 1760s, in 1765, he produces, for example, this very, very large canvas showing a scene from antiquity of the priest Courageous sacrificing himself to save the beautiful maiden Callirhoe. And this is a huge canvas which was acquired by the king, and with the idea that it could have been turned into a tapestry and by Gobelin, and it's still to this day in the Louvre. In 1756, Fragonard travels to Rome. And while in Rome, he meets the painter Hubert Robert and a number of patrons and collectors, and visits a number of places in Italy and Rome, around Rome. And he produces a series of really spectacular drawings. This is one of them, many of which were done at the Villa d'Este in Tivoli. And it is there that he starts studying these beautiful park settings and gardens, which will become a great feature of many of his most well-known works. Fragonard was in Italy between 1756 and 1761. And when he returns, for example, he paints this very beautiful small painting, the so-called small park, the Petit Parc, in the Wallace collection in London now, which just shows a series, it doesn't really have a subject. It shows a series of figures around this park, which is very much inspired by the Villa d'Este at Tivoli, even though it's not a precise portrayal of the villa itself. In the late 1760s, Fragonard also becomes well known for his fantasy figures. And this is a series of portraits, idealized portraits of people from that time. Some, there's still a debate about who they actually represent, but all dressed up in fancy costume. These are not real 18th century clothes. These are fantastic costumes, somewhat Spanish in fashion and from a number of other sources. And they're shown, you know, writing, composing music, doing a number of different things. There is a series of men and women. And these are now scattered amongst various museums. The large majority of them are, of course, at the Louvre, but there is one, for example, at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, one at the National Gallery in Washington, and some are still in private collections. And these really are the beginning of Fragonard painting in this really wonderful, loose way. So you look at these and you realize how each brushstroke is so beautifully placed and so carefully placed, with this idea of freshness and direct, a very direct way of painting. The most famous work by Fragonard from around 1767, so from the late 1760s, is the so-called Swing at the Wallace collection. And this really has all the characteristics that will make Fragonard into this great painter of erotic subjects, of love stories. And so here is this beautiful woman dressed up somewhat as a shepherdess on a swing. There is a man pushing the swing behind on the right. And of course, the woman's lover at the bottom left, looking up adoringly at her. And while she's flying through the air, through this enchanted park, one of her shoes sort of flies off into the distance. And of course, if you are in the position of the lover, you can very much look up at her legs and up her skirt. But this situation, this moment is set in a fantasy park, somewhat inspired by the parks that Fragonard would have seen in Italy. This is not a specific site, but it is one of these magical locations, creations, where Fragonard sets many of his scenes. And of course, to the left is also a statue of Cupid presiding over this amorous encounter, over this love scene. We now focus on the other character of today's episode, and this is Madame du Barry. So while Fragonard was working in Paris and became better known and started working for a number of prominent patrons, he came to the attention of this woman. And Madame du Barry's life history is an incredible parable of fortunes and misfortunes. And it is a truly extraordinary novel-like series of episodes. Madame du Barry was born as a poor girl in France, and she was baptized Jean Bécoud. She was born in 1743, so she was about 11 years younger than Fragonard, but about the same age. And Jean was the daughter, the illegitimate daughter of a seamstress, and it was unclear who her father was. It was rumored that it may have been a priest, but there were a number of other candidates. And she spent a childhood in abject poverty, pretty much. And her mother, to raise the fortune of her family, of her life as a single mother, took a series of lovers, a series of different jobs. And so Jean grew up with a number of different people. But as a very young woman, she became a prostitute. And she came under the attention of a man called Jean-Baptiste du Barry, who was a very famous libertine in Paris at the time, and the two became lovers. And du Barry started promoting his mistress to a series of other notable men at court in France at the time, with the idea somehow that maybe Jean could have come to the attention eventually of the king. And that is indeed what happens. So in 1768, when Jean is in her mid-20s, the king notices her, Louis XV, and this is a very peculiar moment in Louis XV's life. Just a few years earlier, in 1764, Madame de Pompadour, who had been his longest-standing mistress, had died. And that same year, 1768, the queen, Maria Leczinska, also had died. The king, of course, was much older than young Jean, but the two became lovers. And for it to be possible to present Madame du Barry at court, she was married, so the young Jean Bécu was married to Jean-Baptiste du Barry's brother, the Comte Guillaume du Barry. And so she becomes a countess. And even though this marriage was an arranged marriage and the husband never effectively saw Jeanne, she moved into Versailles and lived with the king for a period of about 5 to 6 years. Madame du Barry was the last mistress of Louis XV and lived with him all the way until his death in 1774. She was by his side on his deathbed and stayed with him until that moment. She was, of course, a very divisive figure at court. The king's daughters and the Dauphin, the heir to the throne, and the Dauphin's wife, the future Queen Marie-Antoinette, hated Madame du Barry. There were very politicized, complicated factions at court between the promoters and supporters of Madame du Barry and those against. There was a series of scandals around her presence at court, and one of the most famous incidents was the fact that the wife of the Dauphin, the future queen, Marie-Antoinette, refused to speak to her. And this created almost an international political incident between the courts of Paris and the court of Vienna. And eventually, famously, Marie-Antoinette conceded and spoke to Madame du Barry, and the famous sentence she uttered was, "There are many people at Versailles today," and that's all she said to her. So the life court, of course, at Versailles was rather complicated, and Madame du Barry, for better or worse, found herself in the middle of this. Madame du Barry was a well-known lover of the arts, and as her predecessor, Madame de Pompadour, she launched herself into the promotion of great works of art. And so many portraits by her exist. This is a bust, for example, by the sculptor Pajou, but she also commissioned great pieces of furniture. This is a famous commode that was made for her, and a guéridon, both decorated with plaques of Sèvres porcelain. Both of these and the bust are at the Louvre now. But she also was a patron of painters, and she particularly favored the painter Greuze. This is one of the most famous paintings by Greuze made for Madame du Barry, the so-called broken jug. And here is this beautiful young girl who has a jug, and she's gone to get some water, and the jug, of course, breaks, and she has this sort of broken jug held by her right arm, and she holds flowers in her laps. And of course, it's not difficult to understand that a painting like this would have had a very obvious double meaning about the loss of innocence of a young girl. And of course, Madame du Barry probably could identify with a girl such as this in the painting very directly. In the 1760s, in 1769, the king gives Madame du Barry a house, gives her the Chateau of Louveciennes, just outside of Paris, to the west of Paris, near the River Seine. And this was an older castle, chateau, which Madame du Barry then inhabits and starts decorating. But she also decides that to commission a new pavilion next to the chateau, and she asks one of the great architects of the day, Claude Nicolas Ledoux, who you see here in this portrait with one of his daughters, to build a music pavilion, a pavilion for music nearby, close by to the castle. And this is a print showing what the building looked like. A very small, beautiful, almost sort of square pavilion decorated in the emerging neoclassical style. This is the moment really in the 1770s where what we now describe as the Rococo is sort of slowly coming to an end and merging into a more severe classical style, which we now call neoclassicism. And of course, the Pavilion at Louvciennes is one of these buildings. And Madame de Barry is one of the people at court who starts promoting a much simpler way of dressing. And even though she's incredibly elegant, loves jewelry, while of course many of the courtiers and ladies at the court are wearing very elaborate outfits, she is a proponent of simple white dresses and straw hats, which of course is something that later on Marie-Antoinette herself would pick up and promote. The Pavilion at Louvciennes, as you see from this contemporary plan, was built in the late 1760s, early 1770s. It was actually a very small building. It was arranged over one floor effectively, and it had 4 main rooms. The main entrance hall, which was the main sort of salon, and then 3 rooms towards the river. This watercolor shows the great inauguration of the pavilion. So in 1771, on the 2nd of September, Madame du Barry invited the king for dinner at the pavilion. And this shows the dinner in the pavilion. And of course, for the king to visit the house of a simple sort of aristocrat, effectively, as Madame du Barry was by that point through marriage, and you know, she was mistress in title, but had no official role at Versailles beyond that, was a big honor for Madame du Barry herself. And so the fact that the king would come to her house was a huge deal. And the watercolor here shows precisely that event. The decoration of the pavilion in its interior was unbelievably lavish. Madame du Barry paid a fortune for Pierre Gautier, the great ciseleur d'horreur du roi, the gilder of the works of the king, to produce gilt bronzes for some of the fireplaces at Louvciennes. This is one of them, now in a private collection. And all of the doorknobs and window knobs and fixtures of the windows were done by Gautier. This is the only one that survives, a doorknob, which is now in the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris. And you can see how beautiful it is and how it has the initials DB of Madame du Barry. This came to the exhibition we did on Gautier a few years ago at the Frick collection. And of course, many pieces made for Madame du Barry by Gautier were part of that show. The pavilion still exists outside of Paris, but not without drastic restorations. It was abandoned for a long time. And in the 1930s, the perfume maker, François Coty, bought the property and effectively rebuilt the pavilion. What you see today with the addition of an upper floor is a much restored, much changed building, very much looking back to the plans of Ledoux. And so here you get a sense of the space, and to the back of the pavilion, the facade on the back, look down to the river, to the Seine. And this is the marvelous view you get from the pavilion, looking down to the Seine. And you can see all the way at the bottom right, just sticking up from the top, the Tour Eiffel, which of course wouldn't have been there in Madame du Barry's days. And all of the large buildings you see in this photograph wouldn't have been there, of course. It would have been a much more rural and idyllic landscape. But so imagine this marvelous little pavilion surrounded by a park, a huge park, with the view to the river. All of these trees you see below going all the way to the river are still part of the property. So this is this sort of enchanted pavilion. And for this enchanted pavilion, Madame du Barry decides to commission paintings. And even though most of the pavilion as it is today doesn't have a lot of paintings, so here you see that same room where the king was entertained on the 2nd of September, 1771. And this is decorated with mirrors, with stucco work, with marbles. There is a painted ceiling, but not many painters worked on this pavilion. But in 1771, Madame du Barry asks Fragonard to paint 4 canvases for this room. This is the room at Louvciennes today. And you see the window in front of you is the window that looks towards the river. The window to the right, it's in fact a door that leads to the garden. The door to the left leads into the main salon of the house. And so for these 2 panels where you see the fabric on the left and right, And you can see from the mirrors at the back flanking the window that there were two similar, slightly curved wall sections on the opposite side. So this was a room that had a curved apse on the opposite side of this window. For these four spaces, Madame du Barry asked Fragonard to paint 4 canvases. And the 4 canvases that Fragonard painted are what we now call the Progress of Love. And so you have to imagine these 4 large, huge canvases in this fairly small room. The room at Louvciennes is about half the size, probably, of the Fragonard Room at the Frick. Much, much, much smaller, much more compact as a feeling. And you would have been looking at these park scenes by Fragonard while looking at a real park outside of the windows of 2 of the windows of the pavilion. So the 4 scenes represent 4 moments in the love story of a couple, of a man and a woman, and they represent these 4 key episodes. So here are, in this wonderful park, a girl who is surprised by a boy who just sort of arrives and offers her a rose. This is the so-called pursuit. The girl is probably by this fountain with 2 of her friends, maybe 2 sisters, and this boy arrives and surprises her. But of course, while she's sort of running away, she's also looking back. And you can see that the sculptures in these paintings are very much a commentary on what's happening below. So this is a sculpture. There are 2 cupids and a dolphin up high. And of course, the cupids are wide awake, looking at what's happening, at the spark of love that is beginning in the hearts of these 2 people. The next scene is the meeting. And by this point, the couple, in this case, a different couple, but all of these couples represent ideally any couple who's in love, they're meeting in secret. So by this point, they've become lovers. The man is climbing a ladder into this park, and the woman is looking around, making sure that no one is coming to surprise them. And of course, the presiding statue in this case is Venus, the goddess of love. So this is a sort of very charged erotic encounter between the 2, and we can only imagine what is going to happen next. We then fast forward to the lover crowned. And here are the 2 lovers happily together being portrayed by an artist. At the bottom right, you see a painter sketching the 2 lovers. And of course, this is also almost a sort of joke of Fragonard referring to his job for Madame du Barry and in some ways the king. And it's been said that the young man in some of these paintings has a certain resemblance to Louis XV. But clearly, the cycle was a much sort of more general idea of the experience of love between 2 human beings. And while the 2 lovers crown each other with flowers and listen to music, Cupid, of course, in the statue is fast asleep. He's completed his job. The quiver is empty. There are no arrows left. He has completed his task. And the final canvas is the so-called love letters. And here you have the 2 lovers reading all their old love letters. There is a dog at the bottom, which of course has always been a symbol of fidelity. And the statue in this case is a woman holding a heart, which has been identified also as fidelity, but it's probably a symbol of amitié, of friendship. And there was the sense in the 18th century in France that a great love story, once all the sexual energy was worn out, let's say, would turn into a great friendship. And so the example of this, of course, was the relationship between Louis XV and Madame de Pompadour. When that sexual chemistry wasn't there anymore, Madame de Pompadour became the king's great friend. And even though the king took other lovers, Madame de Pompadour remained as the mistress in title. So this sort of suggests a development in the relationship of a couple as it was understood in the 18th century. The canvases were painted between 1771 and 1772, but Madame du Barry was a very capricious patron. We know of many instances where she did not like the works of art that were produced for her. She rejected them, she returned them, she asked for changes. This happened on a large number of occasions. We know of this happening over and over again. And she did not like the Fragonards. And we still don't know why exactly. Was it the style? Was it the style of these paintings that didn't quite fit with the very neoclassical, simple pavilion? Was Ledoux, the architect, somewhat critical of them? Was it just Madame du Barry? We don't know. Did she not like the way these pictures were set within these luscious parks? Was it the style, the sort of more old-fashioned style, looking back to Boucher, something that she did not like? The canvases were installed at Louvciennes, but soon after that returned to the painter. And Fragonard rolled them up at his studio, at his house at the Louvre, and kept them there for another 20 years. In the meantime, Madame du Barry redecorated that same room with 4 canvases showing more or less the same events about sort of encounters and lovers crowned and sort of the relationship between a couple, but in this case made by the painter Joseph Marie Vien. And these were painted as Greek scenes, still set in luscious parks with sculptures, following in some way the example of Fragonard, but in this case, very much in a neoclassical, much more algid, cold style. These canvases were eventually also removed from Louvciennes, and they're now, 2 of them, these 2 are at the Louvre, and another 2 are in Chambéry. But the story of Madame du Barry is a tragic one, ultimately. In 1774, the king dies. She is pushed out of court. She is sent to a nunnery, and she spends the great part of a year in this nunnery, where she in fact becomes very close and very good friends with many of the nuns there, and she's beloved by the women living in the convent. She's finally allowed to leave, but she basically sets herself up at Louvciennes. Louvciennes becomes her main house, the chateau and the pavilion. She spends the rest of her life based there. She has new lovers, the main one being the Duc de Brissac, who becomes her closest companion for the rest of her life. But of course, what is on the horizon with the reign of Louis XVI and Marie-Antoinette is, of course, the French Revolution. During the French Revolution, Madame du Barry helps many of the aristocrats. We know from most sources that she tended to be a very generous woman, and so many of the people who had criticized her became also the people that she helped to some degree during the revolution. She traveled to London a number of times to try and sell her jewelry, to raise funds, and even though she could have left France and not returned to France, as many other aristocrats did, she always decided to come back to France, and this was, of course, her undoing. 1793 is one of the bloodiest years of the French Revolution. It's the year in which the king is beheaded, first of all, on the 21st of January, followed on the 16th of October of that same year by Marie-Antoinette. Both are beheaded in the Place de la Concorde, and at the end of 1793, Madame du Barry is also arrested, put on trial, and eventually beheaded in the same place where the king and queen had been beheaded on the 8th of December, 1793. The most tragic account of her death is the account by the female artist, Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun. And Vigée-Lebrun knew Madame du Barry very well. He had portrayed her a number of times and met her and knew her well. And Vigée-Lebrun writes in her memoirs about the execution of Madame du Barry. She writes, Madame du Barry is the only woman among the women who perished in those dreadful days who could not stand the sight of the scaffold. She screamed, she begged for mercy of the horrible crowd that stood around the scaffold. She aroused them to such a point that the executioner grew anxious and hastened to complete his task. This convinced me that if the victim of those terrible times had not been so proud, had not met death with such courage, the terror would have ended much earlier. Men of limited intelligence lack the imagination to be touched by inner suffering, and the populace is more easily stirred by pity than by admiration. And so Madame du Barry dies on the scaffold amongst tears and screams in this sort of really horrible, chilling scene. And she is buried nearby, near the Place de la Concorde, in a little cemetery, the Cemetery of the Madeleine, where all of the bodies of the victims of the terror and the French Revolution were amassed in common graves. And the king and queen's bodies also were buried here. And only later, with the restoration, the bodies of the king and queen were moved out and buried properly at Saint-Denis. And the new king of France built this chapel, the Chapelle Expiatoire. And this little chapel and park are built on a vast mound made of the bones of the victims of the French Revolution. And so where you see these roses growing in this little beautiful park, Madame du Barry is buried somewhere there, together with many other people. So with the death of Madame du Barry in 1793, It overlaps with the second part of the story of the Fragonard Room. But to know about what happened to the 4 canvases and what Fragonard did with them in the 1790s, you will have to join me next week for another episode of Cocktails with a Curator.